Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The mysterious executioner that executed Anne Boleyn. One of the most significant and shocking executions of the Tudor period was when Anne Boleyn made her way to the scaffold inside the Tower of London's walls. Anne was the second wife and queen of King Henry VIII, and her marriage to the King of England had changed the country forever. She forced the king's hand to split from Rome and the Pope, as she refused to take his bed before his first marriage had been annulled and divorced. But within a few years, Anne had herself fallen from grace following a number of failed pregnancies that greatly frustrated the Tudor monarch. Henry sought to find a way out of his second marriage and tasked Thomas Cromwell with finding him a solution. So Cromwell spun a web of lies and deceit that saw Anne being accused of incest, adultery and treason against her husband, and because of this she was sent to the Tower of London. Evidence was allegedly gathered against her, and 5 other men were executed before her, including her own brother, for their involvement with Anne Boleyn. But it was inside the Tower of London where the execution of England's Queen would take place. But in what has long been considered an act of mercy for his wife, Henry VIII had organised for a special executioner to come to England to execute her. Much remains a mystery today about the man who in one swift blow of his sword struck the head off Anne Boleyn, but there are a few things we know. But who was the mysterious executioner who beheaded Anne Boleyn? Referred to as the Sword of Calais, the executioner was known for his reputation as a highly skilled headsman who would perform executions with his sword. In England at the time, usually the sentence of death with someone to be beheaded was performed by an axe, or a commoner's axe as it was known. A defendant would place their head upon the block in public beheading sites such as Tower Hill, and then the executioner would swing his axe. However, the problem with using the axe was that it required skill and a very sharp blade to take the head clean off, and throughout history there were many accounts of poorly skilled executioners taking several swings of the axe to execute someone. In the century after Anne Boleyn's execution, Jack Ketch would perform some terrible executions in which he took several swings of the axe to take the heads off of Lord Russell and James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. The executioner's performance on these accounts was so poor that Ketch almost incited a riot, as the crowd was outraged. Despite the crowds wishing to see the execution of someone, they wished for it to be carried out swiftly and in slightly dignified manners where things would go well. The use of the axe itself was much heavier, but the man who took Anne's head was a swordsman who used his own blade. This shocked the crowd when it was unveiled to them inside the Tower of London, but the sword allowed for a greater velocity with its swing, and if sharp enough and performed by a skilled man, then an execution could be much more reliable. The sword also did not need someone to lay their head on the block, placing their chin to allow a queen's swing from the axe. Anne, it's known, was executed kneeling on the scaffold. But in regards to the Sword of Calais, he had been dispatched from the French town to perform Anne's execution specifically. He came with a flawless reputation and was summoned himself by Henry VIII, as he believed his wife should not die by the commoner's axe. It was said that the executioner was an expert in the use of the heavy continental executioner's sword, which could cut the head off a prisoner who was kneeling upright, in place of the clumsier English axe, needing the prisoner's chin on the block. Anne herself would even note of the executioner's skill before her death, and this was reported to Thomas Cromwell by the lieutenant of the Tower. He wrote, "And then Anne said, 'I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck.'" So the reputation of the Sword of Calais had reached across to England, but upon arriving in England, it's likely that he had never performed such a high-profile execution. He must have been bemused at the thought of the King of England summoning him to take the head of his queen. Chances are also that he had been skilled in taking the heads of traitorous nobles or of the common criminal, but never had he before executed a queen. Many executioners throughout history have also remained anonymous, and we do not know the true name of the executioner but his nickname. Even the man who executed the English King Charles I remains still unclear, as he performed the beheading in a disguise, fearful of the backlash he would receive for executing a king. Many people during this time believed monarchs were sent by God to rule, but the Sword of Calais had no need to worry about any threat to him for carrying out Anne's execution as he had been sent for by Henry VIII. Regarding his pay, it was said that he was paid very handsomely for the execution of the Queen, a sum of £23, 6 shillings and 8 pence. He would have also been put up inside the lodgings during his short visit to England. He would have arrived in England with his executioner's sword, a weapon most familiar to him and a reliable one that would allow him to perform his work well. He then made the journey into London after landing and would have been looked after by a royal escort, and it's even possible that he may have stayed in some lodgings inside of the Tower of London itself, or nearby, so he could then be on hand when the time called for him. Of Anne's execution, before she was led out onto the scaffold, he would have stood there either with his face covered by a hood, or stood in his executioner's clothing. As Anne approached, he would have watched her come to the scaffold, flanked by her ladies and the lieutenant of the tower. Now on the scaffold, Anne would have said goodbye to her ladies, and then, as was customary and tradition, the Sword of Calais would have fallen to his knees in front of the Queen. He would have knelt and begged for Anne's forgiveness, to relinquish him of the sin of taking a life. With this, he was then handed a purse of coins from Anne, which allowed him to reap more reward, and this tip was made to make sure Anne had a quick, swift and clean death. Now, as the scaffold cleared, the executioner was left with Anne and in front of roughly 200 strong crowd. The Sword of Calais, then to distract Anne, proclaimed to the crowd, "Bring me my sword," and when he unveiled it to the crowd, they gasped. Anne then turned her head to follow the steps of the executioner, and as she looked the other way, the executioner flew in the opposite direction, and with his momentum drew the blade across her neck, taking Anne Boleyn's head off in one swift blow, whilst she was unsuspecting the approach from the other direction, and she did not see it coming. Now, after the execution, the job of cleaning up the scaffold would have gone to the lieutenant of the Tower and the Tower of London's guards, but we know that Anne's ladies-in-waiting carried her remains inside a wooden chest into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula for its burial. But the executioner would have left in a manner after he had performed the job. He did not display Anne's head to the crowd, which was done to declare the death of someone deemed a traitor, and it's believed he did this out of respect. This was different to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, later, as when her head was raised up to the crowd, it fell onto the floor and the executioner was then there holding her wig. After the execution, the Sword of Calais took his sword, and also may have taken her gown before he then departed the scaffold, and would have begun his journey back to France. It was said in a historical document that the executioner of Calais was given 100 crowns for his reward and apparel, with the apparel being Anne Boleyn's gown, and the Privy Councillor arranging to buy her gown back, as they sought to rid England of everything belonging to Anne Boleyn, and they wanted no relics of her. The sword that took the head off Anne Boleyn was likely to have been taken back home, and then it's unlikely that it survived. Executioners did not publicise their bloody job, and because of this anonymity, it is unlikely that many people were told that the man from Calais killed the English Queen. But today, the Sword of Calais' true identity is not really known. The only way of finding this out would to be find a record in France documenting the executioners who worked in the 1530s in the town of Calais. But was it truly an act of mercy summoning him to take the head of Anne Boleyn? It was certainly seen as a more reliable way of ensuring Anne had a quicker and cleaner death. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.